Was the past really better? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know if there's a real answer to that because I think it depends on who you ask. And it also depends on which part of the past we're talking about. Because when we look back, it's very easy to remember the things we loved, the songs, the friends, the places, the dreams, the people who were part of our lives. And sometimes we even convince ourselves that everything was better back then. But was it really better? Or were we simply different? Because there's something I find interesting when we look back. We don't just remember a time in our lives, we remember who we were during that time. And maybe that's where the real conversation begins. Because perhaps we don't only miss a certain period of our lives, we miss the person we were when we lived through it. But that person, with their dreams, their decisions, their mistakes, their successes, helped build the person we are today. And that's what I want to talk about today. Those we were. Those different versions of ourselves that we have left behind, but that somehow are still a part of us. Welcome to Sin Manual, No Playbook, a space where there are no perfect formulas and no step by step paths. Here, we talk about life as it is, with doubts, with mistakes, with moments of clarity, and others where we are in the middle just trying to understand what's next. This isn't a podcast to tell you what to do, it's a space to question, to feel, and maybe find your own answers, because at the end, no one gave us a manual, and still, we keep moving forward. All right, here we go. And I think actually that music is a good place to start this conversation. Because those of us who have been around for a while have probably experienced something interesting. When we were young, the adults criticized the music we listened to. In my case, I always loved rock music. And I remember adults saying that the music we listened to was outrageous, that it was too loud, that it was violent, and even some spiritual qualifications. And now, many of us are those adults, and we listen to the music young people listen to today, and we say exactly the same things. That music has no substance, it's bad, that is not real music. And then you realize something. Maybe it was never really about the music. Maybe every generation defends the music it grew up with. Because that music is connected to a part of its story, to an age, to a group of friends, to the way we dressed, to the way we thought, to a version of ourselves. That's why there are songs we can hear like 30 years later and for 3 minutes feel like we've gone back to another moment in our lives. Not because the song is necessarily better, but because we were different when we listened to it. And maybe that's why when we say those were great times, what we're really saying is something a little different. I was an interesting person back then. And this becomes even more interesting when we think about our teenage years. Because there comes a time when we stop thinking only about what we want to do today and start asking ourselves what we are going to do with our lives. What are we going to study? What are we going to do for a living? Who do we want to become? And the funny thing is that many times we have to answer those questions without really having enough experience to know the answer. That happened to me. My mom wanted me to study law or medicine, but I wanted to become a salesperson like my father. And in the end, I just studied accounting, and I never actually worked as an accountant. But I did end up becoming an administrator. And when I look back today, I realized that the decision that seemed so definitive at the time was simply one part of the journey. What I studied helped me. What I learned stayed with me. And then life took me in other directions. And I think this happens to far more people than we realize. When we were young, we think we're choosing our future, but many times we are just choosing the next step. And then comes another one and another one, until one day we look back and realize we are living a life that isn't exactly the one we imagined. And that doesn't necessarily mean we made the wrong choice. It means we lived. And that's where our parents come in. Because parents want things for their children. We want them to have a good life, to study, to have opportunities, to avoid the mistakes we made. And sometimes, without realizing it, we project onto them the things we weren't able to become ourselves. We want them to be doctors, lawyers, engineers, or simply to have a different life than the one we had. And many times, or most of the times, we do it with the best intentions. But I believe there's something important here. For me, a parent's goal should be for their children to be better than them, to have more opportunities, to go farther, to be able to do things we couldn't do. But for that to happen, we also have to allow them to be different from us. Because our children don't have to become a version of us. They have to become a version of themselves. And maybe that happened to us too. We had to stop being what other people imagined we should be and start discovering who we wanted to become. And then there was love. Do you remember that love you swore would last forever? That love that at the time you were absolutely certain was the love of your life? Well, some people were right. Some people are still with that person, but most of us aren't. Some relationships ended. Some people found someone else. Some found the person they wanted and let them go. And some are still waiting to find that person. I think we all have a lot to say about love. But maybe what's interesting isn't only asking what happened to those relationships, it's asking who were we when we loved that way? Because we changed too. One relationship can teach us what we want, and another can teach us what we don't want. One can show us a part of ourselves we didn't know existed. Another can show us something we needed to change. And even when some of those stories didn't end the way we imagined, they are still part of our story. And if we are talking about those times, there's something those of us who have been around for a while will probably remember. Waiting by the radio, with your finger on the pause button of the tape recorder, waiting for them to play the song you wanted to record. Because if you weren't paying attention, you missed the beginning. And when the song finally came on, you were praying for the DJ not to say anything. And you had to react quickly. Today, that probably sounds almost ridiculous. We want a song and it's right there. We want to watch a movie and it's right there. We want to watch a scene again, we just search for it. Everything is one click away. And that's not a bad thing. It's part of how we have evolved. But something did change. The waiting. There used to be things we looked forward for days, weeks, even months. We waited for that song. We waited for a movie to come to the theater. We waited for that moment. And maybe that waiting taught us something too. It taught us to enjoy anticipation. Because when the thing we had been waiting for finally arrived, the moment felt different. But I don't think that has completely disappeared. Maybe the things we wait for are different now. We may not wait for a song on the radio anymore, but there are still things in your life that you look forward to with excitement. Something you want to happen. Something that hasn't happened yet. Something that, precisely because you don't have it yet, creates anticipation. And there's something I think it's important to remember. We used to have things that no longer exist today. And today, we have things we couldn't even imagine back then. And maybe that's the problem when we look back. We compare an era we know completely with an era we haven't experienced yet. We remember everything good we had back then. But we don't yet know what things from our present we are going to miss someday. And preparing this episode, I remember the song that I think fits this moment really well. Landslide by Fleetwood Mac. Because it fits that feeling of looking back and recognizing that we have changed, that life changed, that some things that once seemed so important aren't anymore. And that the person we once were doesn't exist in exactly the same way anymore. And then I started thinking, what version of me no longer exists? Because we've all changed. Sometimes because life forces us to do. Sometimes because we made mistakes. And other times because we simply realized that in order to keep growing, we had to let go of a version of ourselves. Not necessary for other people, for ourselves. And this connects to something we've already talked about on this podcast. In the hardest forgiveness, we talked about the things we sometimes have to forgive ourselves for. And in the value of our story, we talked about how our story, with everything that has happened, is part of who we are. And I think that connects perfectly with this conversation. Because looking back shouldn't be a way of punishing ourselves or asking why we didn't do things differently. It's an opportunity to understand, to recognize, to say, that was me. That's what I did. That's what I decided. I got that wrong and I got that right. And this is what I decided to change. And maybe that's what growing up really means. Not erasing an earlier version of ourselves, but recognizing that we no longer need to be that person. And here I want to stop for a moment. Because when we talk about the past, it's very easy to do it through nostalgia or regret or what if? What if I had studied something else? What if I had made a different decision? What if I had stayed with that person? What if I had taken that opportunity? But I think the adult we are today has a responsibility toward all those versions of ourselves we used to be. And that responsibility is to look at them with respect. Because today we have information that they didn't have. We have experiences that they didn't have. We have wounds they didn't have. We have lessons they hadn't learned yet. So, how can we judge the person we were 20 years ago with everything we know today? That wouldn't be fair. Maybe every once in a while we should sit down and remember, without guilt, without shame, without wanting to go back. Simply remember. Raise a glass to those times, to the people we were, to the decisions we made, the ones that worked out and the ones that didn't. Because even those left us something. And maybe that pause gives us a chance to ask, what did we accomplish? What did we change? What do we still want to change? Not to create a perfect scorecard of our lives. Simply to stop for a moment and recognize the road we have traveled. And here I think we also have to be careful about something. Because we live surrounded by messages telling us that it's never too late. It's never too late to study. It's never too late to change careers. It's never too late to start over. And yes, sometimes that's true. But I think real life has circumstances. There are responsibilities. There's family, there's money, there's time, there are opportunities that exist for some people and not for others, and that's real life. And I think we also have to be honest about that, because it's not enough to tell someone they can do anything without knowing the reality they're living in. Maybe we don't always need to start over. Maybe we don't always need to change careers. Or maybe we don't always need to chase the dream we had when we were 20. Sometimes we simply need to recognize who we are today and decide what we can do with the life we have. Because changing direction doesn't mean the road before it was a failure. It was part of the journey. And after talking about everything we have left behind, there's another question that I like even more. What version of you is still there? Because not everything disappears. Some things remain. Maybe the person who still enjoys the music they listened to years ago is still there. Maybe that child who gets excited about something simple is still there. Or maybe the person who still laughs at something silly is still there. The one who tells jokes, the one who collects something, action figures, the one who still enjoys singing in the shower, the one who still gets excited about a movie, the one who is still curious. And maybe growing up doesn't mean leaving everything we were behind. Maybe growing up also means deciding which parts of who we were we want to keep. Because there are versions of ourselves we needed to leave behind, that's for sure. But there are others we don't have to lose. Maybe that curiosity, the ability to laugh, that passion, that music, that way of enjoying the little things, they're still part of us. And that's also what growing up means. Not becoming someone completely different, but learning which parts of ourselves we want to carry forward. So now I want to ask you, what version of you is still living in there? What part of the person you once were is still part of who you are today? And there's something we may not think about often enough. We are talking about our past. But the moment we are living right now will also become the past. The adult you are today will one day be a version of you that you remember. The decisions you are making today will one day become part of your story. The people who are in your life today will one day become part of your memories. The places where you are right now, the things that worry you, the things you enjoy, all of this will one day be part of those we were. And that changes the way we look at the present. Because maybe the adult we are today should live with a little more awareness. Not so we're constantly thinking about the future, but so we recognize that the person we are today will also become part of who we were. And maybe one day we will look back and raise a glass to this version of ourselves, to the decisions we made, to the things we accomplished, to the things that didn't work out the way we wanted, to the people who were there, to the people who left, to what we decided to change, and to everything we decided to keep. So I come back to the question we started with. Was the past really better? Maybe not. Maybe it was simply different. Every year had something that no longer exists today. And every era also has things we have today that we couldn't even imagine back then. Every version of ourselves had something special. And every version had its problems too. The teenager who didn't know what to study didn't know what we know today. The person who fell in love believing it would last forever didn't know how that story would end. The person who made a decision and later changed it didn't have the perspective we have today. And that's okay. We can't expect the person we were 20 years ago to have the experience of the person we are today. All those versions did the best they could with what they knew at the time. Some got things right, others got things wrong. Some made us proud, others taught us exactly who we never wanted to become again. But all of them left something behind. All of them brought us right here where we are. And maybe that's why when we look back, we shouldn't only ask, was that time better? Maybe we should ask, what did that time leave me with? What did that person I used to be leave me with? What did I learn? What did I keep? What did I have to let go of? Because remembering doesn't have to mean wanting to go back. We can remember and keep moving forward. We can look at who we were with respect, even with affection. We can raise a glass to those times, to the decisions that worked out, to the ones that didn't, to the people we were, to everything we learned. Because we can't go back to being who we were. And maybe we shouldn't want to. But we can be grateful for those versions of ourselves, to that child, to that teenager, to that young person who didn't really know where life was taking them, to that person who fell in love, to that person who made mistakes, to that person who had to change, to that person who learned, to all those versions of ourselves that, in one way or another, brought us here. And there's one last question I want to leave you with. You don't have to answer it right now. Maybe you don't even have an answer. But think about this. And this is something that I loved when I was making this episode. If you could sit down today with every person you have ever been, what would you say to them? If you could sit down today with every person you have ever been, what would you say to them? Maybe you would tell them that they did the best they could. Maybe you would apologize to them. Maybe you would thank them. Or maybe you will simply raise a glass to them. Because every one of those people is also you. And while you are here, remember one more thing. The person you are today will someday be one of those you used to be. So maybe it's worth living this version of yourself with a little more presence. Because someday you will also look back and remember this moment. And after looking back for a little while, I think it's also worth coming back to the present, to the person we are today, to this moment. Because this version of ourselves, it's also building the story we will one day remember. So, if you made it this far, thank you so much. Thank you for giving me your time. And thank you for taking some time for yourself. I'll see you in the next episode, and remember, everything will be okay.